Welcome to Straight Talk. As the impact of the Canterbury earthquake sinks in, thoughts are turning to the cost of setting the agricultural infrastructure in the province right. There are fissures in paddocks, broken irrigation lines and fencing no longer able to do the job. How will the fast-track legislation passed by Parliament help? Is a revamped emissions trading scheme in Australia on the cards, with former Climate Change Minister Penny Wong changing roles? And Fonterra is going for gold with UHT production for Asia. What's it mean for our exports? Today I'm joined by National Business Review editor Neville Gibson and Milford Asset Management's Bryan Gaynor. Well, Neville, how do you think the government has reacted to the earthquake emergency?
I think we can go overboard in saying it's the government's job. I think local government and everybody who had a role in any kind of disaster like this has done really well, I think, from the police, fire, civil defence and that sort of thing. The government is really the icing on the top. In fact, they'd probably get on the job better if they had fewer politicians down there.
Yeah, indeed. Do you think there's been a bit much of that, Bryan? Jerry Brownlee and John Key touring around visiting affected citizens?
No, I think at the time of something like this, I think people like to see the politicians there, even though they're only there probably for ceremonial reasons and aren't doing very much. I think it gives people the feeling that they're being looked after, that someone is looking after their cause. And to me, this earthquake has been handled very well, as Neville said, by all the authorities who've been responsible for different aspects of it.
Right, OK. And certainly farmers have seen they've got some great organisations behind them. Federated Farmers has been very active, and Fonterra was giving away water and just generally being there.
Everyone, you know, farmers, shopkeepers even, which would surprise some people. and no doubt rural communities rally around at any time of a disaster like this, and probably it took a while for it to sink in. But news about the silos, the people helping out and the milking sheds and all that sort of thing was fantastic coverage, I thought, in the media and bring across that good news.
Right. Now, what about the legislation that the government's passed, which suspends some other regulation in order that rebuilding can happen more rapidly? Well, there's some fishhooks in this.
Well, I haven't read the detail of the legislation, but from what I understand, it sounds quite draconian. It gives a lot of powers to certain people, and I wonder whether it's really necessary. I mean, obviously, some form of emergency regulations could go on that don't upset most people's day-to-day activity, but this seems like going overboard. If in fact the laws are impeding reconstruction and that sort of thing, or maybe we should look at those bigger laws.
Right, what do you think, Bryan?
I just think in exceptional circumstances like this, you do have to probably bend the rules or make things a little bit easier for people. It all depends on how they're going to be interpreted. The big thing is about when you change rules or give more power to people who haven't had that power in the past, is how they utilise that. And it comes down to the individual, the individual groups, whatever it be, a local authority, etc. I'm optimistic, but because I do think that this has been such a big event that you do need to look at things a little bit differently, be a bit more flexible. So I'm not too negative on the things that have been done down there.
Right.
One hopes the legislation will in fact have that sunset clause in it, because the other governments, certainly not in a country like New Zealand, have put in emergency regulations and laws, Tonga for example, and they don't seem to take them off.
Yeah, that's very important that they do have sunset clauses. There's a definite period when they come to an end. I agree with that entirely. Is
there a risk that there could be a precedent set here? I mean, groups like Federated Farmers, they've mounted strong opposition in the past to some aspects of the Resource Management Act. Now these are being curtailed, albeit temporarily. Is there likely to be some push for something to happen on a wider level?
Well, the thing is, you don't really want to weaken any of the laws that were there. The reason that the earthquake didn't prove as disastrous, certainly no loss of human life, is because there were strict building codes, and you certainly don't want to be running roughshod over some of those rules about how things are rebuilt. And I wonder if the speed of reconstruction is all that necessary. Certainly in residential areas, people can switch to other houses, that sort of thing, but no major building or infrastructure has been damaged.
Right.
That's a very important point, is that our rules have ensured that there was no loss of life, albeit the earthquake was in the middle of the night. I think that was quite helpful. But it does show that what we have in terms of building requirements and rules seem to be working, to the extent that the damage could have been far worse in terms of human life if we didn't have the type of requirements we have.
Right, OK. Now, turning to the overall economic cost of the earthquake, Bryan, there's been some punts taken on this by Treasury and some of the banks. What do you think in terms of it's a very difficult thing to judge, isn't it?
Yeah, your word punt is very appropriate because it is very difficult. I mean, first of all, we have the loss of production in this quarter. Canterbury represents about 15% of production of the country, and the assumption is that this quarter will have a negative impact. After that, it will have a positive impact as the rebuilding goes on. But there's a huge amount of variables in there. For example, tourism is quite important to Christchurch in the Canterbury region, and we don't know to the extent that the TV coverage internationally has led to people cancelling or deferring visits to New Zealand because of it. So it's very, very hard to measure, although I do think we can say it will have a positive impact upon the economy from around this time through to probably about a year's time as Christchurch and Canterbury is being rebuilt.
Right. What about the effect on agriculture specifically, Neville? That's a big part of it, isn't it, in terms of Canterbury's
production? It certainly is, but we've got the example of Chile, where at the moment, 6 months after their major earthquake in February, which was hugely destructive of one major city, much bigger than Christchurch, and it hit all the agricultural area as well, grapes, orchards and that sort of thing, but they're experiencing growth of predicted to be 8%. So, but I think farmland survives pretty much. I mean, if it's just fences, a bit of irrigation, these can be rapidly brought back into production.
But there's another aspect in the mix there, isn't there? Some farmers suffering the double whammy of South Canterbury Finance and also the earthquake on top of that, Bryan. What's the effect likely to be there?
Well, my feeling is there's not a lot of farmers who have suffered from South Canterbury Finance. They tended to be people who've sold their farm and had invested the money in South Canterbury Finance, so they're ex-farmers more than anything else. And I don't think that the receiver is going to be too tough on people who are meeting their current obligations regarding loans from South Canterbury Finance. So I don't think that's going to have a major short-term impact upon the farming community.
What do you think, Neville? There was quite a complicated web of different companies Alan Hubbard was in control of that had lent money out to, 25 or more dairy farms, large dairy farms? It
seems the reality of South Canterbury Finance and all the associated problems with it are taking a lot longer to sink in for some people in Canterbury than the earthquake. I agree with Bryan. I don't think if people have borrowed from South Canterbury Finance, they'll obviously have to keep servicing those loans, one hopes, because that is really the key to the government recovering most of the money back, as if a lot of those loans that may be impaired are in fact paid for, but they were largely to non-agricultural areas.
Right. And what's the timetable there, Bryan? All indications are that these matters would like to be dealt with pretty rapidly in order that there's some clarity of looking at exactly what the situation is.
Well, my feeling about it is that it's likely the government is effectively the receiver. The receiver is representing the government. And now after the earthquake in Canterbury, it'll be less inclined to put a lot of pressure to collect money from people who have borrowed money from South Canterbury Finance. So I think you can't discount the impact that the earthquake could have on the receiver's actions and take things. So I don't think that we will get a normal receivership here. I think it'll be more slowly collection of the money to make sure that there's not too much of a disruption on the Canterbury economy.
So that might be a good effect of the earthquake in some regards.
Well, yeah, but over time the South Canterbury is going to have a big impact because all those loans eventually will have to be rolled over and banks will have to pick them up, and the banks will probably be a lot stricter in terms of the conditions that they impose upon these loans than South Canterbury will be. So those who have had loans from South Canterbury should be okay as long as they're meeting their interest, but when they try to roll them over, when they mature, they're going to find the conditions are going to be tougher.
Right, OK. Now, just getting back to the earthquake side of things, the effect on the insurance industry, that's going to be pretty serious, isn't it, Neville, in terms of a big one-off claim level?
Yeah, they haven't had a big hit like this for a long time. In fact, premiums have... what happens when there's no disasters, premiums tend to float down. In this case, they'll go the opposite way. Of course, there'll be a big injection of funds from offshore because all these companies are covered by reinsurance, but then they have to pay much higher fees to get that reinsurance back, and that's how it works. So and you can expect insurance payments to go up over the next 3 to 4 years.
Right. And that will have an effect across the economy generally, Bryan?
Yes, but I think Neville's point is very important. We tend to think that insurance companies get hammered by this, but the reinsurance is now such an important part of an insurance company. For example, Tower has said the immediate reaction in the share market was this would be devastating for Tower, but it's estimated the after-tax impact is 3.5 million. The company makes about 45-50 million, so it's not a huge impact on one of our major general insurance companies. Yes, they will lift rates in the future, but that's more long tail. It's not a devastating impact upon the insurance industry.
Well, we'll watch that with interest. After the break, we look across the Tasman and see what agricultural issues will push the buttons of the new Gillard government. Stay with us. Welcome back to Straight Talk. Now it's on to You Said It, comment in the ag media, which we want to delve into further. Bryan, Julia Gillard, she's going to be sworn in as Prime Minister in Australia. What can New Zealand farmers expect to see in terms of any change that might be coming?
It's very difficult, I'm afraid. I spent most of last week in Australia talking to economists, talking to business people, and there's a real uncertainty of how this new government is going to operate, particularly with depending on a Green MP and 2 independents. So I think it's very difficult for us to say at this stage the impact it's going to have in New Zealand. My personal feeling is that this government, unlike most Labour governments in the past, will probably be more favourable towards the Australian agricultural sector, which could possibly mean a slight negative impact upon agriculture here. But that's as much as I could predict at this stage.
Right, because there's a lot of uncertainty as to how long the government will actually be able to hold on with that very slim level of support, isn't there?
Yes, there is. And, you know, the business people are keeping their fingers crossed that it will survive. Not that they're great supporters of the Labour Party, but they would prefer a stable government rather than going back to the polls or having an unstable government. But this is a new experience for Australia. It's been the 1940s since they've had this kind of a government in Australia. They're not used to it. There's an argument that democracy is working in Australia, but there's also an argument this is the last thing we want. We need to go back to first past the post. We need clear government. So we have to say about Australia at the moment, it's an uncertain political climate.
Right. And what about the emissions trading scheme, Neville? In some respects, that was part of Kevin Rudd's downfall. Is it going to be making a reappearance? Well,
she's made some very interesting appointments. Both of the agricultural portfolio and the climate change portfolio have gone to people who have been powerful unionists in the past. And in the agricultural area, they're hot on biosecurity, so that's not necessarily good for New Zealand. And on climate change, it would appear, from my reading of what's been going on, I haven't been to Australia recently, is that the carbon tax idea is certainly going to get some traction. So maybe not a fully blown trading system as we've got at this stage, but certainly a carbon tax is back on the agenda.
And we might see some moves there fairly rapidly, perhaps.
Oh, I think so, because that was fairly much a big issue for the Greens and Labor in the election, apart from the broadband issue.
Right. Likely to be any change on that thorny issue of apple exports from New Zealand into Australia?
It sounds like the Queensland Senator, who's the new Minister of Agriculture, spoke only of